Okay, Anthony, you asked me, what is Marxism? There's no simple answer to this question, and I absolutely refuse to give you a simple answer. I'll give you the best answer I can, a long answer, and I'll try and wind up with something that may be a bit more satisfactory to you. But I don't want to see you editing out of this something that's like a simple answer. There have been too many simple answers to what is Marxism to have me adding to them. Now, to help me answer this question, I'm going to share a screen. You may know that I'm one of the admins for a site called the Marxist Internet Archive. This is a site that's been around since the early 90s, so it's about 30 years old. And although it struggled with its mission in the early days, it was launched because people who are Marxists were fed up with people forming the belief that Mao Zedong and Stalin were representatives of Marxism, and a look at China or the Soviet Union gave you some kind of representation as to what Marxism was. So they decided that given this internet had come along, that they would provide an archive of the writings of Marxists so people could see for themselves. And it was not their intention to present a definition or a true normative definition of what Marxism really is, but simply to represent Marxism in the form of an archive of the writing of Marxists. We pretty soon came across difficulties in doing that. And in the end, after some, maybe decade of debate, abandoned all attempts to have a yes-no answer to the question of whether some writer, was a Marxist or not. So what we arrived at was that Marxism was a tradition of political practice and a tradition of thinking, or of science, if you like, and hopefully a close connection between the two. But it's very, very diverse. So having decided that and arriving at the need to represent all the vast array of people that claim to belong to this tradition of Marxism on the internet, to make their writings available whether we like them or not, we realized that people still needed for us to represent some answer to the question of what is Marxism. So the first answer we gave to this question is to pick out a list of, there's about 20 writers here. They're all writers from the past, beginning with Marx and Engels, their early associates, their followers at the turn of the century in different countries. A number of the Bolsheviks that made the Russian Revolution are included, leaders of communist parties in Europe and in India, Latin America, around the world. And the list comes to an end at the end of World War II. We made a decision not to include recent writers because we didn't want to privilege any particular current or group as having some special claim to Marxism. But the idea is that in the writings of this 10 or 20 writers, substantial bodies of work, one can get a true representation of the spectrum of writings that can be called Marxism in the truest sense. Now, these writers don't agree with each other. There have been furious debates and arguments between them down the years, but that's in the nature of any tradition of belief, of practice, of science. Right? You'd have the same problem if you asked what is Christianity or what is science. Right? Now, so far so good. We also provided a more normative definition of what Marxism is by a beginner's guide, where we presented a list and links to classic works of Marx and Engels the original founders of the movement, on philosophy, economics, and politics. This was an adequate definition of what Marxism is. It's a tradition of political thought that was initiated by Marx and Engels and has had a long and troublesome history. One of the early decisions we made in the presentation of the archive was not to include Mao Zedong and Stalin specifically as in the list of selected Marxists, but nor to ban their writings. In fact, we decided to include the largest available archive of their writings. That is to say, we recognize that they were not Marxist in the sense of their political practice, and the ideas they espoused were not Marxist. They were alien to the aims of Marxists. But nevertheless, they historically grew out of the tradition of Marxism, and we couldn't wash our hands of them. Yeah? That the Russian Revolution was clearly an expression of Marxist thinking. The best Marxists at the time supported the Russian Revolution, but it was blockaded, surrounded, it was hit by famine and war and crushed and eventually degenerated. And what came out of it was nothing that resembled anything that any Marxist ever fought for. To try and give you a succinct definition of what Marxism is, there's a phrase that Marx uses somewhere, the critique of all existing social conditions. And by critique, he meant not only verbal criticism and analysis, but practical work to try and eradicate, undermine, and limit, expose the worst elements of existing social conditions. And that's what our job is. Now, historically, particularly beginning around the early 20s, you had a development of Marxism that took place within the academy, in the universities. And it was the idea of some Marxists at that time that it was important that Marxists develop their theory with proper rigor, and that was best done in the academy, which was set up to develop ideas in a rigorous fashion. But what developed from that really was some very good theory, but divorced from practice. On the other hand, you had people that built parties that developed their own theory in connection with their practice, but often in very degenerate and limited forms of theory. Marxism is not a current that advocates state control. Right? It definitely advocates that control over the economy and political institutions should be a collective practice, like a democratic practice involving the vast mass of people, and particularly those who are included in a decision, insofar as it's a political current. Most Marxists accept that this is a struggle that passes through the state. But Marxists do not aim to seize control of the state, but rather to get rid of it. Our aim is a world in which people control the conditions of their own life, free from exploitation and domination by others. But how to get there is not a simple thing, and Marxists worthy of the name realize that it's not a simple question. No Marxist worthy of the name is actually opposed to winning elections and getting government that way. Why? Why would you be opposed to that? But we also recognize that getting a majority in Congress or Parliament, whatever you have, is usually marginally helpful in achieving the aims of Marxism, of socialists generally, any kind of socialist, of putting control over people's lives into their own hands. The reason being that all the really important institutions in a country, from the legislatures through to the military, police, and especially the companies which provide means of communication, means of production, are all dominated by capital. So it's a conundrum. And it's a conundrum that Marxists are always working towards, how to break the hold of capitalism, of capital, of what Bernie Sanders called the billionaire class, because Americans apparently suppose not to understand words like capitalist and worker, how to take power away from their hands in a way that can successfully transfer that power to the millions of people that actually produce the means of life. Not an easy thing, because the fact is that passing power into the hands of billions of people presupposes a high cultural level, a high level of organisation, and a democratic structure penetrating from top to bottom, and that doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in any country. Elections are either more or less corrupt, but they never touch upon the real basis of power. So Marxists address themselves to these problems of how to produce a genuine democracy, not a fake democracy, and that is our aim. And ultimately, people have a vision of going beyond that, where political questions no longer trouble people, where people can live in harmony. But that's for the future. I hope that helps.